Mediopolis and the Show World. This is a speculative work of fiction. Talk, listen, watch. Chapter 1. Everyone knowing everyone, everywhere. That was the saying of the ultimate goal of the integrated universe programs, who had a social drive, if premature. In reality, it was some people just watching some people somewhere, some people listening to some people somewhere, and some people talking back at some people somewhere too. Before, with no technology, there was that fear of nobody really ever knowing anyone, anywhere, except in the immediate space and time that one was within. Until the recordings had begun, there were only really the stories for the blind and the pictures for the deaf. You had to try and imagine what the visuals or the sounds were, unless one visited the theatre, because the theatre couldn't easily visit you. It couldn't visit everyone, not be everywhere. It couldn't easily travel to far, distant, rocky, remote places, like mountains, for example. You had to pilgrimage to one of the great arenas to be part of the show, and hope you got there early enough to see and hear people much. Many late people, and some poorer people, would only be there distant at the back of the crowds, only hearing the mumblings or seeing a distant vague dot in the distance. They could only hear the loud shouting actors, for others strained to hear the mumblings. Still, you often got a good view of the crowd watching the crowd from the tiered stadiums that eventually allowed many more audience participants. Often children and dwarves and younger, smaller people were allowed to the front of the audience at the untiered arenas, where often there was great jostling for position so that each person could see. Chapter 1. Watch At. The young female home care assistant had had a number of elderly clients to visit. She'd just been messaged on the care app. The directors had told her about clients that lived reasonably nearby for her to drive to, whose care needs were compatible with her ability assessment ratings. She was often sent a selection of potential clients, some irregulars that she'd visited occasionally before. Often she would do a new visit, since it was a big city, and although her ratings weren't reasonably that low, they weren't unreasonably low. So many only needed a very limited number of things anyway. Relatively simple work. She pretended it was that way, and it was easy enough to get through. Made a change from the other jobs as well. Even if the earnings were less, she needed every hour's hard credit. And it was hard to earn that much, so she took as much work as she could. The elderly man was in his usual bedsit, on a high-rise block of flats. At least she might get a nice view, from out of the apartment windows, of the city night glow. Take a picture of her, with the city lights behind, perhaps, if he seemed friendly enough, and was open to it. It wouldn't cost him anything anyhow, to let her look at the view. She wasn't going to zoom in on anyone or anything. The mechanical elevator that she got into at the apartment slowly rattled up its pulleys, chanting away, slowly moving its way upwards in the building, only shaking a very little. The waft of a chlorine that greeted her as she read the random posts on the walls of the elevator various residents and visitors had left behind on the elevator walls, with the sign above stating smokers would get washed out. She didn't want anyone anyway. She didn't want to any more anyway, unless it was outside in the fresh air. She was relieved there were the flip and the chair that she could perch on. The flap-out chair that she could perch on, although it hardly seemed worth taking the effort to sit. The journey was quick, for it was just a second-floor visit. She arrived directly, finding the elevators unoccupied. The lobby was empty. She inserted the ID into the machine. It took her up to the correct floor, as usual, and the door to the old man's room, at the end of a long corridor, opened automatically, a minute after the elevator had allowed her out. So she entered with a recording of an old woman's voice, stating from surround speakers, "Your visitor followed by a recording of the visitor home carer name, has arrived. And it repeated this several times, getting a little louder each time. Your visitor, home comforter, has arrived. Until rousing from the sleep, the old man turned off the old robo-maid. With just a shake of the hand, it was a motion sensor, turning off the audio recording he'd had programmed for each visit. And the man went to the glass door of his room. Could see clearly through it. It was the same home comforter he'd had visit before him. Had the same character, the same chatter at the door. He didn't have conversations through the glass door, of course. It was more of a so you could see the person, have a small chat, as well as hear who they were and who you'd be opening up to. Some of those cheaper home comforters you could even smell through the glass with their wafty perfumes, quite strong scented smells. Nobody stole my ID, it's me, she smiled grimly at him with a smile. After his inspection seemed so long, was he buying time just to ask about her journey, casually, while seeming to struggle to find the buttons, press the right combination that would open the door? Why did he keep that drawer of so many remotes by the door anyway, she wondered. Well, don't get upset about it. I couldn't give mine away either. He tried to joke, making a silly laugh. Well, nobody wants anybody's when they really find out what they're about, said the home carer, grumpily. I never found out. I guess I always knew, or no one ever taught me any different, stated the old man, finally rummaging through the door, finding the right remote for it. Are you going to let me in, or am I just standing out here to be scanned all night? She said, searching through a handbag. It only takes a minute or so. So, my gosh, in my day, scanning could take an hour or more, began the old man, searching through the remote, looking for the right button to press now. I know, and it's a wonder anyone ever saw anyone, she said, glancing through messages on her phone, brushing then past him once he finally did open the door, pressing the right combination of buttons. The door swung open. She went in to survey the room, whilst the old man then returned to his drawer of remotes, trying to find some order, untangling some of the wires in some that have gotten tangled up, placing each of the remotes back into the labelled holders, hanging them up carefully, separately, so that they could easily be found next time. His temperature remote, the lighting remote, the cleaning remotes, the door remotes, the drawers under the holders remotes, and all the replicas of them too. The replicas of the chair remotes and the bed remotes as well. They were the new ones. He'd only just got the bed remotes because the mechanical bed that had to be moved and adjusted was the new installed that came with its new remote to learn. And then, of course, all the old computer remotes that he had stored there, some of which he used and others were just old remotes from computers he wasn't sure if he'd maybe need again. In case there were so many drawers and drawers of different ones, the top drawer was just the usual remotes that he used more frequently, and he hung the usual door remote up back in its usual place. In case he got into any troubles, if one of the remotes got lost or slipped under the bed perhaps, or it got broken somehow, something wrong with something spilt in it, goodness knows how many things had happened, or it got slipped down the back of the couch once, gosh, went under the sofa one time, somebody dropped it, one of the visitors' children. Somewhere he just couldn't reach it because he was older and in a lot of pain and arthritic and just couldn't get that low. His old bones were more painful at the joints now he was getting older. It made stretching too far or doing silly bending exercises much harder, especially crouching low and getting under beds and sofas and things, much more challenging. That remote wasn't found for weeks, but he couldn't look under them himself. Should just get them all merged or something into one big remote, make it all easier, said the home comforter, going to assist him with untangling the last of the remote wires. I'm used to the way things are, stated the old man, content that they were now all mostly back in their places, the last wires untangled. Why didn't all the comforters know just to put them all carefully away, without being told all the time? No wonder their ratings are so low. Not awfully low, but modestly, compared to others, thought the old man, and he thought that of her in a way, though looking at her he wasn't so sure. She had many things to speak of well as well. One of his irregular visitors, though. He didn't see her that often, only when the regular ones couldn't really make it, and were all booked up by others, or he couldn't afford them that often. Seeing the unsuitable clothing under the coat that she'd just taken off. It was hot in the apartment, and very cold out there, he understood. Those long corridors, with doors that only opened for programmed visits, got awfully cold outside. She followed him out of the long entrance, stepping now into the lounge. It was a grungy sort of dive, though, with things that were just haphazardly, thoughtlessly placed here and there, many random items, tables with just gatherings of different ornaments crammed from different cultures, places, visits that didn't really go together, didn't make sense, colour schemes that clashed in different corners of the room. Still, in their own separate parts, they made some sense, but not as a whole. Moving between the different places, she wondered if he had lived a rather haphazard style of living, drifting around from one relationship, one job to another, without really settling down for much. Wandering around, she thought of all the different things and different colours and styles of fabrics that he collected. They were all nice of themselves, but they just didn't mix that well together as a group, though. They weren't placed in a curated, stylised way together. The place was a little grubby too, a little dungy. It really just could do with a thorough cleaning, much more than it had been in a long time, she thought. Yet not too bad. It was a wilting home, not rotting quite through, though. Well, it smelt very musty and a little damp in places, what could be smelt still through all the thick smoke. She followed him over to the ventilated area, where she preferred to chat with him, where the glass window could open out and vent out to let a little air in. The glass window did open up, and he did it with the remote control, slowly, and it took time for him once more to find the right buttons, to find the drawer under the drawer of remotes. At the table he'd wheeled along behind them. It had followed them behind the wheeled chairs that they rode on. They both arranged themselves then on either side of the glass window. It then opened up, once the table had wheeled itself in between them during this procession. Strangely, the voices of some man asking questions was now suddenly being played. She glanced over at the large wall to the other side of the room to see the images projected out onto the wall of an older man, scrubby, but well-dressed still, sitting on a small stage, being asked many questions by a larger, wandering presenter in a smart uniform, in a well-dressed, sleek uniform, with a large row of older men sat behind him, all sat there cross-legged, looking stern, and sat composed, thinking, staring at the two men talking. Sat to one side of this with a close-up image of various reactions of a whole range of audience members, different faces, all in a tiered audience. They were all reacting in different ways to an old man's questioning as he strolled around the stage, pointing, glancing, making gestures toward another man sat in this chair. One of the show trials, the old man watched. He said it, although he rarely voted on it, he said, any more. He often watched these trials of old men, called the show trials, because you could get to vote on what happened to them. Sometimes the vote of the audience would be considered in the view with the experts that happened to be on that week. So it happened to depend upon what the issues were and whether you were qualified to discuss them. And if the old man happened to be having some specialist interest, something that he had studied, then he might be voted to vote occasionally on those issues. And that's what the algorithms had assessed as most useful for him now. The program had assessed his subject interests and abilities based on his own demographic profile. He was a former trialer himself. He'd been on the show a few times when called to out of necessity a long time ago. So he had got many different trials to view occasionally. As he got older, he was sent a lot of older programs too. The trials were only viewed at certain hours of the day. There were the nights of the funny old men, comedic shows by older men that were a little funny, for older men by older men. Since he was